Wildfires. Created by a deadly weather combination of heat, drought, and wind, they can destroy everything in their path.
Go, 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 go!
These are the stories from people who work in extreme weather.
Boom.
We just lost a big window.
It was just like a bomb went off.
Holy
and nobody is coming to save you.
And the storms they'll never forget.
Wham! Crack! Bang! Bang! Bang!
Holy we're going to die.
Plus, the how and why behind the world's worst weather.
Mother Nature is one mother.
Extreme weather is ravaging the planet, now more than ever before. Hotter and drier climate conditions provide the perfect fuel to literally feed the fire. Around the globe, wildfires are growing larger, more numerous, and deadlier every year.
We're looking at more wide and varied extreme events. That means potentially longer and more fearsome droughts and heat waves. And that essentially is how wildfires are born. You have a stretch of very dry conditions, throw in a few lightning strikes and wind, bingo, you have a fearsome fire.
Wildfires can also create their own weather systems. The extreme heat causes water from trees and plants to evaporate into the air. This additional moisture then creates clouds that not only look like thunderclouds, they act like them too. During a wildfire, no place is safe, not even on a lake.
From my experience as a photojournalist, I've seen many wildfires, and I've realized that they can move very violently. One of the areas that I've found to be a safe haven are lakes because of all the water, but all that changed.
For over 25 years, Greg Welch and his wife Julie have been avid hikers and kayakers. But within 24 hours of their arrival in Boundary Waters, Greg and Julie's comfortable camping trip will go up in smoke.
Greg! Julie!
September 2000, a hot, dry, windy day. As Greg and Julie enter the park, they are greeted with an ominous sign.
There was actually some smoke coming across the road, and there was some ash coming down from the sky.
A park ranger flags them down and alerts them to the situation. A forest fire caused by a lightning strike has been burning for 3 weeks.
He wanted to know where we were going to make sure we were going to be safe, and he gave us some tips on areas not to go to, and basically told us that the fire was quite contained, was not moving rapidly at the time, and we should have no problems at all.
The fire is 14 miles west of their destination.
He did say that we should expect to see some smoke within our area because the wind was blowing from the west and we were east of the fire. So that should not surprise us to see some smoke in the area.
From his experience with forest fires, Greg is confident the fire is at a safe enough distance.
All right, thanks a lot.
He and Julie set out, undeterred by the fire blazing far away.
We really didn't consider ourselves to be in any danger at that time. We were very much enjoying the day for what it was. It was a very warm, pleasant day, light breeze, sunny. When we left the lake in our kayaks, we just enjoyed the nice, warm day.
Thank you. Okay, looks good.
It's a good spot, yeah.
Good.
Around 2 p.m., winds pick up and begin to gust, just as Greg and Julie spot a suitable campsite on the lake's western shore.
At that time, we were experiencing smoke coming into the area. And my wife and I thought back about when we had talked to the ranger, and it didn't give us a lot of concern because he told us that we would experience some smoke in the area. So it was not a big concern for us at the time.
Thank you, yeah.
The science of wildfires is fairly well understood. It's two real issues. You need the fuel, which is tinder-dry forests, grasslands, that sort of thing, and wind is the other component. The faster the wind, the faster the fire spreads.
They set up camp, but Greg and Julie can no longer ignore the warning signs.
Sounds like somebody's coming.
Where there's smoke, there's fire.
You know what?
We were looking at the sky, and it became more of an ominous, smoke-filled sky. So I got my camera, and I started taking pictures of the lake, of the trees, and of the sky. And when I reviewed the pictures, what I could see in the pictures was something we could not see with our eyes. And that was orange streaks kind of shooting through the sky. We couldn't see it with our eyes because of all the smoke that was in the area.
You know what? I think I'm gonna...
That was when we decided that we actually may have a problem. This thing may be actually moving at us. We were also hearing some small noises back in the woods, and it sounded like tree branches breaking, but way off in the distance, just a little snap and then another snap. Not very quickly, but repetitively. So I told my wife I'm gonna run up to a little creek that was just north of where we were camping, and I was gonna look down that creek to see if I could get a better view of what was going on.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen, all for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
As he rounds the bend of the river, Greg is not prepared for what he's about to see.
What I saw was just a very surrealistic scene. The fire was everywhere.
The fire that was 14 miles west of them is now just 3/4 of a mile away.
I was pretty terrified at that moment because I very quickly realized how quick and how close the fire actually was.
Julie!
My first thought after seeing the fire was my wife.
Julie!
Julie, we gotta go. We gotta go now.
Julie! Fire's coming!
Those noises got much louder, and instead of tree branches breaking, it now sounded like trees breaking.
Julie, we gotta go!
We grabbed the last bag.
As Julie heads to the kayak,
Come on, let's go!
Greg grabs her life jacket.
You could really hear the fire coming through the woods now. It was very violent, very noisy, very dark and smoky, and very disorientating. I wasn't even sure I was going the right direction. You could definitely feel the heat, though. I brought the life jacket down to Julie and told her to go. And as soon as she left the shoreline, she disappeared into the smoke.
Hikers Greg and Julie Welch are surrounded.
Come on, let's go!
Their last resort is to escape onto the lake, as water is a safe place during a fire. Or is it?
As I was still standing there on land, the fire actually came over the bank behind the smoke, and it literally was blowing over my head. Trees were lighting on fire all around me, and of course I knew at that point I needed to get away from the land, so I pushed off from shore and headed out into the lake.
Julie loses sight of Greg and cries out his name.
Greg! Greg!
But the raging fire is louder than a screaming freight train.
She was very concerned about me because she's witnessed the fire coming over the shoreline into the lake area. In her mind, she had thought I had not have made it at that point. I could hear her, but she could not hear me.
Julie!
Greg!
And then as the smoke kind of lifted off the lake for a second, we could see each other. So that was a nice moment where we knew that both of us were okay.
With the forest ablaze, Greg and Julie think they will be safe on the water.
The wind that was pushing the fire was upwards of 50 miles an hour. Lots of ash in the sky, lots of soot building up in our eyes and our nostrils and our mouths. My immediate thought was asphyxiation from the smoke. It's kind of like being in a house fire without any doors to get out. Julie was in a separate kayak, and the smoke was kind of picked up off the lake for a second by the wind, and it actually blew her sideways and literally flipped her out of her kayak into the water.
Julie!
Surrounded by a sea of flames and choked by smoke, Greg tries to rescue Julie from the frigid northern lake.
Julie, drop my paddle!
But I couldn't do it because the wind was so strong, I couldn't get to her. So I jumped out of my kayak into the water to slow myself down. And in about 10 minutes' time, we were together again in the water, hanging onto the kayak. At that point, we kind of took in the scene around us, which now was just as black as midnight, full of smoke. Everything was on fire. No matter where we looked, in 360 degrees around us, everything was on fire.
It's the battle of their lives. 50-mile-an-hour winds continue to feed the killer blaze.
Everything was totally engulfed in fire, so our thoughts were about staying out in the lake. But it took a lot of energy to do that because of all the waves and the wind. The water temperature was, 50 degrees. My wife was starting to shake uncontrollably. So we decided that we were going to make landfall because we were getting hypothermia. We could see a piece of land that looked like it had not been on fire. So I climbed up on top of the rock, pulled the kayak up on the rock, and as we were doing that, it started to rain. It was a very violent, strong downpour of water. The rain got stronger and harder and faster, and it actually felt more like buckets of water coming down on us than it did like rain showers. Very violent, very dramatic amount of water coming down. So it was a very intimidating night.
What happened next took them by surprise. As quickly as the downpour started, it stopped. Without warning, everything changed.
You very quickly realized that all the noise that was being produced by the fire that we had been experiencing for about an hour just stopped. I mean, instantly. And the smoke started to clear. The rain had actually put the fire out.
As hot air rises above a wildfire, the moisture from burned vegetation condenses into rain clouds. Rainfall from these clouds can extinguish the very fire that created them. They survived the fire, but as a cold front moves in, will they survive the night?
We decided that we needed to stay there on that land for the night. It was too late to go back from where we had started, and so we decided to make camp on that little strip of land. There was a dry bag, actually, that had rolled up on the same shoreline we were at, and in that dry bag was our only dry sleeping bag. So then we just kind of settled in and got into a dry sleeping bag. I had a camp stove that had survived the fire, so we used the stove for heat to heat our bodies back up.
Greg and Julie spend the night. They are wet. They are cold. But they live to see morning. The fire at Boundary Waters burned for 16 miles and destroyed nearly 100,000 acres.
If you're in a forest, there's no safe distance to be away from a forest fire or wildfire, and that's simply because of their unpredictability.
For Greg, who's been embedded with wildfire crews as a photojournalist, the experience gave him a new respect for the violent power of fire.
Well, I learned to be more observant of any forest fire, no matter how far it is away from me. Because of our experience in the Boundary Waters over the years, it literally saved our lives. Without that experience, we most likely would have not have survived.
Fire can create its own weather systems, and weather itself plays a crucial role in the spread of wildfires. Hot days dry out trees, and dry winds propel fire. Nowhere more so than in California, where wicked winds of the west can create monster firestorms. October 1991, Oakland Hills, California. A small forest fire, driven by high winds, begins to spread. Within minutes, it's a wild inferno, devouring the forest and threatening the lives of residents.
Wildfires are really a byproduct of a weather event. It's essentially hot, tinder-dry conditions, a spark from some lightning, and then throw in some wind into the equation, and you have a wildfire.
The Oakland Hills wildfire spread so rapidly and mercilessly, it shocks everyone. Firefighters, residents, even seasoned journalists who thought they'd seen it all.
I'm a television news reporter from the San Francisco Bay Area. In over 3 decades of television reporting, I've covered earthquakes, floods, fires, but this one particular wildfire in Oakland is certainly one that I will never, ever forget.
October 20th, 1991 was meant to be one of the best days in Rob Roth's life.
Hey. Oh, thank you.
That was the due date. My wife and I were expecting our first child.
As Rob prepares for work, he's excited and anxious about the prospect of becoming a dad. He and his cameraman head out to cover a routine story, the dying stages of a minor brush fire that firefighters had all but extinguished the day before.
The weather that day in October was typical October weather in the Bay Area. It was warm, it was breezy but not overly windy. An ideal day. It was a beautiful day, actually. Nothing unusual. And in fact, it had been a relatively quiet fire season. The idea was that we would do a story that said, hey, we had this small fire yesterday, but overall, it was a pretty uneventful fire season.
Rob and his cameraman head up to the Oakland Hills, the site of yesterday's brush fire.
In and around the San Francisco and Oakland Bay area is the combination of topography and the different air masses that influence the weather. What we've got is an area off to the east, the mountainous terrain, the Diablo Mountain chain, off to the west, the Pacific Ocean, a series of canyons and valleys that these winds flow from the Pacific down the mountain ranges. They can funnel, become stronger, down these canyons, down these valleys. And what this leads to actually is a lot of variability in the weather conditions in very short distances, what meteorologists call microclimates. So in one area, hot, dry conditions could be occurring, and yet maybe only a few miles away, much moisture and cooler conditions being influenced by the Pacific.
When we got there, there was a crew of firefighters, and they were actually wrapping up. There was no sign of any stress or pressure or anything other than this fire's out, we can clean up and go back. In fact, I did a report standing right where the fire had been. That's how safe it was to be there at that point.
Hello, I'm Rob Roth, and today we're back on the scene of a fire which began burning yesterday afternoon. Let's go have a closer look.
And then the winds kicked up. And they were swirling winds, and they were increasingly more and more powerful. All of a sudden, I noticed in the area where the firefighters had been, there was a flare-up. So what had been maybe a little brush that was still smoldering had kicked up. And as the winds kept pushing through, this flare-up got larger and larger. And I'm thinking, well, the firefighters are here. They'll know what to do. They'll be fine. They're on it. But they couldn't quite get it out, and it kept spreading, and it kept getting larger and larger. And it seemed that in a matter of just a few minutes, the whole canyon just filled up with smoke. I had never experienced the winds that I was experiencing there, in that winds generally come from one direction, but these just seemed to be swirling. They were coming from my left, from behind me, from the right. And as these winds would come, it would create more and more smoke. And so all of a sudden, our news car, which couldn't have been more than 100 feet from where we were, I couldn't see our car from the smoke.
Rob was sent to cover the story, but now he's about to become part of it. The fire is propelled by 70-mile-an-hour Diablo winds, warm gusts that blow in from deserts to the east.
These warm, dry winds come down the slopes of the Diablo mountain range right into the San Francisco Bay Area. And this is particularly dangerous because we've got a lot of dry trees, grasses that would be obvious fuel for forest fire situations. Combining that with the hot, dry winds coming down from the Diablo mountain range, the Diablo winds, these can fan the flames, cause small brush fires to become much larger wildfires.
The fiery air rises, creating a swirling updraft.
When we have winds blowing, sometimes almost up to hurricane force, 70 miles an hour, 75 miles an hour, it's almost like a flamethrower or a blowtorch on these fires. The fire can spread very, very quickly. If you're not prepared, if you haven't been watching this fire, it can become a very, very dangerous situation.
As fire grows and burns vegetation, it creates its own fuel, and in turn, creates its own wind. The very definition of a firestorm.
And if that happens,
we continued to film.
off of that ridge, it can actually...
They were just coming from all directions, these winds. Smoke was filling the air. You could sort of feel this getting away from the firefighters. It just wouldn't go out, and it just kept getting larger and larger and spreading. You really couldn't see very far because of the smoke, but you could kind of tell that, you know, it was well beyond what the firefighters were able to handle. It was as if gasoline was being poured from the sky. As these winds would come in, you'd get these whoosh, this gust of flame that would just shoot up, and then a new fire would pick up. It was very scary. And I looked around and I realized that I could no longer see where the firefighters were. The situation at hand was getting worse by the second. We knew we were in trouble, and there was a certain amount of fear that was starting to build up. I was also thinking that this is impossible that this could be happening on this day, because this was the due date for my wife's and our daughter to be born. I got overwhelmed with sadness for an instant, thinking that, you know, maybe my wife may have to sort of go through this by herself. There was fire to our right, there was fire to our left, and in front of us and up was the fire, and it was beating down on us. We're talking 2,000-degree heat. It was just its own monster. For a quick second, my photographer, Nick, and I looked at each other, and we thought, uh-oh, what do we do now? And at the same time, I was kind of being filled up with this sense of sadness. My daughter is supposed to be born on this day. What's my wife going to do? It was extremely dangerous and confusing. The fire at this point had its own weather system. It wasn't responding the way normal fires do.
When we talk about wildfires creating their own weather systems, what we're really talking about is a wildfire that has grown to a certain size, a certain proportion. Huge amounts of superheated air is rising up in the atmosphere. That warm air wants to rise. As that air is rising, it's being replaced at the surface by winds from other directions. Dry conditions coming in from the east, moisture conditions coming in from the Pacific. But as those winds meet at the base of the fire, a lot of turbulent mixing, a lot of vortices can set up. And so what we're literally talking about is the creation of a firestorm. A firestorm then is creating its own weather, its own wind system. So it's a very catastrophic situation when the wildfire grows to such a size that it can become a full-fledged firestorm.
The fire is now burning on 5 fronts.
It was like a monster out of control. The sound was just so loud, you had to shout over it. Areas that we had been in minutes before were now under siege by this fire. We weren't prepared for anything like this.
Rob and his cameraman struggle to breathe through the thick veil of smoke. A wall of fire separates Rob from his vehicle, making escape impossible. Just when he thinks there's no way out,
a fire truck came out of the smoke. The battalion chief said, "You guys better hop on." We got on and they just gunned it out of that area.
the fire has spiraled completely out of control.
These firefighters were not there to fight the fire, they were there to evacuate and get people out. That fire truck was the last vehicle that could get out. If that fire truck had not come when it did, I'm sure I wouldn't be sitting here right now. That whole area where we were was completely devastated. That area looked like a moonscape.
Rescued from the killer blaze, Rob and his cameraman are attended to by paramedics.
My photographer was complaining that his chest hurt, that he had perhaps breathed too much smoke, and so they took him just to give him some oxygen. But we still had this fire to deal with. I ended up feeling like I could, continue, the hope that, other people got out of this area. I was still able to breathe, luckily, so I went back to the station and began putting this story together.
The fire killed 25 people and wiped out nearly 3,500 homes. It was one of the deadliest fires in California's history. For Rob, memories of the Oakland firestorm are both painful and poignant.
At one point, the battalion chief, James Riley, had gone to help a woman who was in some distress up in the hills. They found his body next to her body, and it appears that they were struck by power lines that had come down. And he was killed on there, probably within several minutes of him telling us to get on the truck. He was gone. His funeral was 8 days later, and it was 8 days later that my daughter, Casey, was born, and I couldn't go to his funeral because of that. But I remember thinking just that I'm forever grateful that I was able to be there when she was born. And it was, thanks to Chief Riley and his crew. This fire had a very deep effect on me personally. It took something as deeply emotional as my baby being born to sort of get me out of the sadness that I'd been feeling about what had happened at this fire, and to Chief Riley.
The Oakland firestorm changed the way Rob covers wildfires, no matter how non-threatening they may appear.
A fire can change on a dime. This was way beyond anything that I had ever experienced before. This is definitely a day I will never forget.
Wind can spread fires, and fires can create their own weather. But what happens when it rains after a fire? Known for its location and climate, California has seen fire and it has seen rain. And unfortunately, when these weather events happen in this order, mudslides can occur, causing horrific damage. Daniel Dreyfus is a photojournalist who's traveled the world, capturing incredible stories.
I've seen some pretty extreme things in my career.
Over the past 12 years, he has witnessed destruction in all types of environments, from deserts and jungles to wildfires and urban centers.
My photos have been seen in publications throughout the world, including the New York Times, CNN, The Guardian, San Francisco Chronicle, the LA Times, and many more. As a photojournalist, I've traveled the world photographing devastation, but this was the weather event I'll never forget.
There's a number of different conditions that could create a landslide. In this situation, it's a combination of you have very steep slopes because it's a fault line where the land is actually rising, and then we had a severe fire that removed the vegetation, which made the hill more susceptible to a landslide.
December 4th, 2017, Santa Barbara, California. Daniel receives a call from his editor.
It was about 5 a.m. I picked up the phone. All she said was, "Ventura's on fire, go now." As a photojournalist, if you're covering a fire, you need to have the proper fire gear. So you need to have everything a firefighter has, pretty much. So I quickly grabbed my fire gear and headed down to Ventura. As I got closer to Ventura, you can see the glow from the Thomas Fire.
The Thomas Fire, as it would be later called, named after Thomas Aquinas College in Ventura County. The fire started as a small brush fire, but then accelerated into a full-on wildfire, spreading quickly through the rugged mountain terrain due to the strong Santa Ana winds.
These are very hot, dry winds that come down from the Santa Ana Mountains into the coastal parts of Southern California. Very low humidities, literally giving ideal conditions for forest fire conditions. That if forest fires develop, these Santa Ana winds can flame them up, can intensify them, make them even more powerful.
The 101's right on the coast, and it sort of turns, and you can see more Ventura, and I can see the glow from the fire a couple miles away. All of downtown Ventura had been evacuated. The fire was 2 blocks from down Main Street. There was a lot of destruction. There was a lot of houses on fire, apartment complexes were on fire, and there was a lot of fire trucks. I looked for people trying to get out. I looked for firefighters fighting the fire. The smoke is a huge factor when you're out covering a fire. I mean, if you don't have goggles, you don't have a mask, it can get really difficult to breathe. There's a lot of smoke. So it's physically draining. I was covered in soot all over my face, my hands, my camera gear gets pretty beat up sometimes. There was an elderly couple
Hey, you okay?
And they were telling me that the home was over 100 years old, and they've owned it their entire life and just passed it down to their daughter and her family. And the woman was just devastated. I mean, that's all I could do, photograph it and tell her story. Being able to tell those stories is important. Without photojournalists or videographers, there aren't fundraisers, there aren't people to help without the knowledge.
These are downslope winds. These winds can accelerate as they come down. They're warm winds, compressed as they slide down that slope. The other concern we have is an inversion in the atmosphere. A layer of warm air above the ground keeps that air sort of very stable, trapped in the lowest layers, almost ducts the air, funnels that wind down towards those lower elevations. If we've got very dry conditions with respect to the trees and the bushes and shrubs, a lot of fuel potential for the fire, all of these ingredients coming together can lead to a catastrophe.
Some houses, you know, you see the whole house gone, but you see half a room left with pictures still on the wall. Or you find stuffed animals that have been burnt but aren't completely burnt. And you find half-burnt pictures. You know, that part is hard. You know, you see that and what people can lose in an instance from a fire. So seeing this, I mean, it was difficult. It was very difficult. But, you know, trying to separate that and focus on photos and trying to capture what's happening is important as well.
The main driver behind the Thomas fire in terms of how quickly it spread and the amount of acreage that it ended up burning up was, again, back to these Santa Ana winds. Wind speeds of 65 miles an hour, fanning these flames. What we're talking about is these winds, the capability to add air into the fire, the fuel that drives the fire, and also then driving the fire forward into unburned areas, tilting the flames towards the unburned areas, almost like a flamethrower or a blowtorch, sending embers farther downstream into where there are unburned areas, causing those areas to catch. So that, again, main factor here for how big the fire was, how damaging it was these Santa Ana winds.
Just over 1 month from when Daniel received that fateful call about the wildfire, the phone rings again.
Hey, what's up? It was about 6 a.m. when I got a call from an editor telling me to get to Montecito as fast as possible. There's been a mudslide.
The wildfire was extinguished a month ago, but it's still wreaking havoc in the California hills. The flames had destroyed plant roots that stabilized the soil, creating the perfect conditions for a mudslide.
So I jumped in the car and tried to drive to Montecito, only to encounter numerous roadblocks and people telling me that I can't drive on the 101 because it's been flooded.
In common practice, we refer to them as mudslides, but it's more than just mud. There's debris, large objects that can get transported, and so a more correct term would be landslide. What's happening in a landslide is that the soil on a hill is being mobilized and it's moving. So the land is actually moving with the water down the hill and then being deposited somewhere else.
I really had no idea what to expect. When I got to the first location, I realized how bad it was. This isn't just a mudslide. I mean, the whole mountain came down.
Geological Survey estimates that 25 to 50 Americans are killed on average each year as a result of landslides. This is more than earthquakes.
There was debris everywhere. The entire street, cars, debris, everything was under 2.5 feet, 3 feet of mud. There was people trapped in the hotel. It was surreal because the editor kept telling me to go to a retirement home that was up that street. And I kept telling him, like, I physically cannot go there. So I called the editor. I said, listen, I physically can't go there. The mud is 3 feet deep. I didn't bring any gear for this. And so our conversation was, can you go here? And I kept saying, I physically can't go there.
Daniel, like almost all of the Shock residents in the area, could not fully comprehend what had happened during the early morning hours of January 9th. While residents were sleeping, at approximately 3:30 a.m., half an inch of intense rain fell within a 5-minute period, creating a natural disaster.
That's extremely intense. In most of North America, a very rainy day would be maybe an inch of rain. So to have that amount of water concentrated in such a short period is a very extreme condition.
In addition to the rain, it was the conditions left by the previous month's wildfire that allowed water to flow without barriers.
The fire leaves behind it a thin layer of ash, and that ash is very quickly mobilized, and that then leaves the soil completely exposed. And raindrops, when they hit that bare soil, they can disturb it. It kicks it up almost like a mini bomb, and then redisperses it very smoothly, and this creates a surface crust. So that surface crust prevents water from infiltrating into the soil like it would normally. And instead, it's trapped at the surface, it accumulates, and then becomes overland flow. That small amount of sheet flow, as it moves down, gets bigger and bigger, and as it increases and concentrates, it has a lot of energy, and that allows it to pick up and displace progressively larger objects as it moves down the hill. In this case, it's not the water that causes the destruction, it's the debris and the material that comes with it.
Materials such as vegetation, cars, houses, and boulders. Daniel not only witnesses the destruction, but needs to document it.
Seeing the size of those rocks were just, I mean, rocks taller than a semi-truck were moved. There's cars that are up to almost to the windows in mud. There was tons of debris from homes, paperwork, beach chairs, anything that's in a person's home.
We don't do a good job of mapping out the high-risk areas for landslides, and more importantly, where the material is going to be deposited. Because you have two areas of risks: the land that will slide, and then where that material will be deposited. And often we have people living in areas where that material could deposit, and there you end up with the destruction. And we don't have good maps categorizing that risk. With flooding, we do it really well. We draw a line on a map around a river and say, this is the dangerous zone, that's the safe zone. We could do something quite similar with landslide mapping and hazard mapping, but we don't have the same degree of maps in Canada and in the US.
I climbed through the mud, tried to get to different areas to take different shots. My boots and my pants are 1.5 feet deep in mud, socks soaking wet. As I was climbing through mud and trying to get better angles to get shots, my phone's going off, directing me different ways, trying to go to different areas. At one point, there was a car floating down the 101 in debris, so I tried to get there. There was a search and rescue team from Fresno, and so I went with them, searching cars, poking holes, trying to find bodies or survivors. I was so focused on trying to get photos and trying to figure out where to go that I didn't have time to think about my own safety. hiking through the mud and seeing some of these houses, it really was surreal. To see a two-story house that had moved 50 feet from where the foundation was is unreal. Seeing houses covered in mud up to the second story and watching search and rescue teams go in is hard to watch. And it's emotionally draining. You're trying to piece it together and like how an event like this can really happen and within an instance.
The Thomas Fire destroyed 1,063 buildings, over 281,000 acres of vegetation, and caused 2 fatalities. Its aftermath led the way for the Montecito mudslide, which leveled 65 homes and killed 21 residents.
It's surreal to see how weather can change in that short amount of time.
We need to have better mapping so that we can protect residents. I think it also speaks to the impact that climate change may have on our communities, because in many areas we are expecting to have more severe fires in the future as a result of drier winters and warmer conditions. And at the same time, we are expecting to have more intense rainfalls. And so the risks for landslides like the one that was experienced in this case are going to stay with us and in fact, maybe even become more likely in the future.
It was heartbreaking to know that some of these people were not in an evacuation zone, were not warned. Nobody saw the scale of this happening. And to see that in my own backyard, I mean, to see in my neighborhood, it really hits home. Separating myself from that is difficult, but I'm there to do a job and I'm there to tell their story. I tried my best to show the sheer destruction, the emotion, the loss, to tell that story, to tell that this weather-related incident is powerful, and to hopefully share with the world that this can happen to anyone.
Windstorms. They come in all forms. Hurricanes, cyclones, and freak wind and rain. These are the stories from people who work in extreme weather.
Oh, we just lost a big window.
It was just like a bomb went off. And nobody is coming to save you.
And the storms they'll never forget.
Wham! Crack! Bang! Bang! Bang!
Holy we're going to die.
Plus, the how and why behind the world's worst weather.
Mother Nature is one mother.
Hurricane Katrina was an extremely destructive and deadly Category 5 tropical storm. It was one of the 5 deadliest hurricanes in the history of the United States. As Katrina hits the coast, its front right quadrant, which held the strongest winds, slammed into Gulfport, Mississippi, devastating it.
The difference between a cyclone, a hurricane, and a typhoon, they are all the same, but they occur in different ocean basins. In the North Atlantic and Eastern Pacific, we regard these cyclones as hurricanes. But in the Western Pacific, so off of Taiwan, the Philippines, and Japan, they designate these storms as typhoons. And then in the Southern Hemisphere, by Australia and even into the Indian Ocean, they are known as cyclones, but they are all the same thing, just with a different name.
George Karunas has lived a rarefied life. As a professional storm chaser and videographer, he's traveled to all 7 continents, capturing extreme weather phenomena, and has perhaps literally seen it all. Throughout his 25-year career, bearing witness to Mother Nature, he's had some close calls. But in 2005, covering Hurricane Katrina, his job landed him directly in the crosshairs of a deadly storm.
Hurricanes are the strongest, most vicious storms on Earth. They are marine weather phenomena. They form when you have very warm water at the surface and you have thunderstorms that form and they cluster together, and the spin of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, causes these clusters of storms to congeal together and form this rotating mass with a calm central eye of low pressure. A really strong hurricane can have sustained winds that approach 200 miles an hour. In the case of Hurricane Katrina, the storm surge was 10 meters above normal, 28 feet. That's the height of about a 3-story building.
The storm surge is the reason why Hurricane Katrina was deadly. That water had nowhere else to go but completely into Louisiana and Mississippi.
In my career as a storm chaser, I've experienced about 20 different hurricanes, but this one is the one I will never forget.
August 26th, 2005, Gulfport, Mississippi. George Karunas and his storm-chasing colleagues arrived to report live updates of Hurricane Katrina as it hits the shores.
This is George Karunas. We're down here in Mississippi getting you up close and personal with Hurricane Katrina.
I ended up teaming up with some friends from Canada and some other associates from the US. And the weather forecast for Katrina was so good that we were able to drive from Toronto all the way down to the Gulf Coast and know exactly where we needed to be. Gulfport, Mississippi.
George and his team choose Mississippi rather than New Orleans to record the storm.
The weak side of the storm is the side that hit New Orleans. The strong side hit Mississippi, where I ended up. When a hurricane is coming ashore, it rotates counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. So the strongest part of the storm is going to be the right front quadrant, where you have the rotational speed plus the forward speed. And that's where we want it to be, either right in the eye or just to the right of the eye. Once we're in Gulfport, Mississippi, we have to try and look at the forecast and see if we have to relocate somewhere else. So we're looking at all the computer models. But more importantly, we're scoping out bunkers, good places where we can ride out this hurricane.
The U.S. National Weather Service issues a dire alert.
An inland hurricane wind warning is being issued for the next 12 to 24 hours.
So we knew this monster was bearing down on us. And one of the scariest things of hurricane chasing is when you get in position and you're waiting for the storm. And you know that even if you leave right now, you're still not going to be able to escape the storm. We call it the point of no return.
The winds are now at 130 miles per hour. The team looks for a safe but advantageous location to ride out the storm, but still be able to record it.
And I found this perfect building. It was a multi-level parking garage, steel-reinforced concrete. This thing was basically a bomb shelter.
When a hurricane hits, go to a shelter that is designated by the government officials that is deemed safe. These are usually brick or concrete in structure, and these can withstand the immense forces of the wind, but also it's inland, so it's further away from the storm surge.
They park their vehicles in the safety of the garage and start prepping their gear.
The best part was that this parking garage had open sides, so we could experience the winds blowing through it, but we could still hide in these little nooks and crannies and shelter ourselves. We'd have to worry too much about the walls collapsing in on us.
Due to potential storm surges and water rising in the city, the only direction for safety is up. A multi-level parking garage appears to be the safest place to ride out the storm. Or is it? Katrina makes landfall in Gulfport, producing winds of 118 miles per hour and causing coastal storm surges of over 30 feet. As the streets begin to flood with ocean water, the parking garage appears to be the perfect hideout.
The parking garage was, I believe, 5 stories tall, which was great because as the floodwaters came in, we could reposition our vehicles and drive up higher and higher. So whenever the winds shifted or if the flooding came in too high, we could reposition. Despite all the warnings, I felt very confident about this particular structure. So it ended up being basically our bomb shelter.
The National Weather Service now issues news about the current storm and its destruction.
They were talking about things like appliances and small cars becoming deadly airborne missiles. They were talking about human suffering on a scale that is unimaginable. Any livestock left outside will be killed. I've never experienced wording this strong coming from an official government warning. And that was the signal to me that we were in pretty deep. And we didn't know if we were going to survive the next 24 hours. But there was one thing we knew for sure. The place where we were standing was about to become the most dangerous place on planet Earth.
August 26th, 2005, Gulfport, Mississippi. Hurricane Katrina's winds, reaching 120 miles per hour, are pummeling the shorelines. Water levels are rising. George Karunas and his storm-chasing colleagues are reporting on the hurricane for news outlets.
Really picking up right now. This is a huge system. This is the mother of all storms.
They are protecting themselves in an elevated parking garage.
So what you have to do is find some type of shelter and then put yourself in the path and let the storm overtake you. And hopefully the building that you chose is a strong enough bunker to withstand this.
George and his colleagues realize how bad this hurricane really is.
Once we read that warning, we realized the gravity of the situation.
Hurricanes are devastating, and it really doesn't matter what stage the hurricane is at.
You guys really get a feel for what's going on here.
We could hear the wind start to pick up, get louder and louder. And then you could start to hear the whistling of the wires, the smashing of glass, and the rumble of the building starting to shake.
As these wind speeds begin to pick up and the circulation begins to spin faster and faster, we now have a Category 5. It's not just the winds that are very devastating that can easily move houses off of their foundation. We now have storm surge to worry about. Think of it as a hurricane is like a giant straw. So it lifts up and sucks up the sea. So a storm surge can go many, many kilometers inland as long as the hurricane continues to maintain its strength. It's a very serious, and it's also the most deadliest component within a hurricane. That's intense erosion along the coastal areas, intense flooding that could last for days, even weeks, power outages, and people just without food and clean basic water for months even. The storm surge associated with Hurricane Katrina, this was the deadly factor with this hurricane.
We were there for a variety of reasons. We were sending reports back for the Weather Network. We were documenting the entire storm from start to finish as filmmakers to show people how bad these storms get, and hopefully they'll heed the warnings the next time a storm like this comes around. Because of the construction of this particular building, there are lots of little corridors and stairwells and sheltered areas where you can get out of the wind, but the howling wind is mere feet away from you. So it's a perfect vantage point to be able to do some live reports. Because this was a multi-level parking garage, we were able to reposition our vehicles. So as the storm surge flooding came in, we were able to reposition so that we didn't completely damage our cars. They were our lifeline. At the end of the storm, that was going to be the only way for us to get out of there. As the winds ramp up and we reach the maximum intensity of the storm, to get from point A to point B, I literally have to crawl across the ground. Because if I were to stand up, I would have been blown away like a kite. The wind was that strong. And it's not so much that the wind is blowing, it's what the wind is blowing. It's full of debris. There were pieces of sheet metal flying around like helicopter blades, which we nicknamed the decapitator. There were pieces of office furniture coming out of the nearby bank building. The winds are so strong, you can't even see across the street. Every time you step into the wind, it's a struggle. You're being hit by debris. Every raindrop hurts. You have to worry about tree branches. There are a million things in your mind, and you don't know which is going to be the next unseen thing that comes out of the murk to kill you. I don't think I've ever felt so trapped in my life. We were about a half a mile inland, and we still had water that was up to my waist. Because the winds in a hurricane, they rotate around a central point, as the storm progresses, the winds are going to constantly shift. So if you position yourself or your vehicle in a place that's safe right now, an hour from now, the wind is going to be impacting it. So we had to constantly move our vehicles, position them to new places. This storm was more intense than anything I had ever experienced. Once the storm surge flooding started to inundate the parking garage, that's when things really ramped up. I did not know if I was documenting what was ultimately my own demise. We didn't know if we were going to survive the next few hours. It's like being in a blender for 8 hours. You can hear the sound of buildings just being smashed, glass breaking, debris. It was surreal. During the middle of this storm, it was so ferocious that there was absolutely no way that any kind of emergency service could possibly get to you. 911 was off the table. It wouldn't take much to kill one of us, all of us. The oppressive feeling of the storm trapping you in this one location is hard for me to put into words. You can't step outside because you're going to get blown away. You can't drive out of there because the floodwaters have come up. There is literally nowhere you can go. You're at Mother Nature's mercy.
Now that the storm is over, George can finally witness the devastation and destruction.
I am blown away by what I've seen. It looked like a bomb had gone off. There were trees down everywhere, arcing power lines. We could smell the gas from gas leaks. And literally the town was just smashed to bits. I'd never seen that kind of widespread destruction.
1,833 people lost their lives. In addition, Hurricane Katrina left thousands of people homeless, destroying 800,000 homes.
In all of my years of storm chasing, I still have not seen damage like that from a storm. This was a widespread tragedy. I like to document extreme phenomena. They only become natural disasters when they affect human populations and habitations. A hurricane that's spinning out to sea, that's not a natural disaster. It's just the earth trying to equalize itself. But when they impact towns and cities, that's when they become disasters.
Hurricanes can hit fast and furious when approaching mainland. What happens when a powerful typhoon hits a cluster of small islands? The Philippines is the most storm-exposed nation on Earth due to its position along the Ring of Fire typhoon belt, a large Pacific Ocean region where many of Earth's volcanic eruptions and earthquakes occur. On average, 80 typhoons form over the tropical waters near the Philippines, with about 19 per year entering the country.
You can expect a typhoon to form at any time, at any given month in the Philippine area. And this is what we saw with Typhoon Haiyan.
Storm chasers are known to primarily chase tornadoes, but Josh Morgerman is different. He chases hurricanes and typhoons.
I've been chasing hurricanes for over 25 years.
All of a sudden, just boom, just out of nowhere, the wind just picked up again really fast.
I don't just chase the United States, I don't just chase North America, I chase everywhere. So I'm going to East Asia, I'm going to Australia, every hemisphere, every continent, hunting down the most dangerous storms in the world. I've been inside the jaws of about 35 or 40 hurricanes, and I would say this day was one of the worst.
The Philippines are susceptible to hurricanes mostly because of where they are situated and how their country is distributed. It's a whole bunch of islands that are speckled about, and every single one of these islands is in a tropical area that's prone for hurricane activity. These waters can generate typhoons year-round. It's not a hurricane season like what we see in the North Atlantic. They, on average, get about 9 to 10 typhoons each year, and that's not even counting the ones that just brush the islands occasionally. They can see upwards of 20 to even 30 storms form in this area. In many cases, because these storms have a lot of ocean to grow around within the Western Pacific, is that they grow to these massive sizes, even greater than what we see in the North Atlantic at times.
Hurricanes thrive on warm water and a certain upper atmosphere environment that has a very low wind shear. The Philippine Sea, which is the body of water to the east of the Philippines, is this perfect breeding ground. Any cyclone that enters that sea just seems to explode into a monster, and Haiyan was no exception.
Tacloban City is the most populated city in the Philippine province of Leyte. There are over 240,000 residents in the most eastern cluster of islands in the Philippines. November 8th, 2013.
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
I will be checking in.
Josh arrives at his hotel in Tacloban City.
Put it on my credit card there. Yep.
The Philippines is the world's ground zero for powerful typhoons. There's no country on Earth that is hit more frequently by very violent typhoons. Usually my first hint that I'm going to be chasing a hurricane or a typhoon is that I see it in the computer models. The computer models are like a crystal ball showing what might happen in the future. What was unique about Haiyan was that it showed up very, very early on. The computer models 2 weeks before it hit were showing this really intense typhoon crossing the Pacific like a bowling ball and just crashing into the Philippines. And what was incredible was how accurate they were so far out. It was like they just sniffed that this was going to be a really unique event. In this part of the world, in this time of year, in the fall, you expect typhoons to get very strong. So to some degree, Haiyan was what one would expect. What was unusual was how powerful it became. A lot of times when hurricanes and typhoons are moving, they actually move in a zigzag. They wobble a little bit, and it makes it hard to figure out exactly where the center is going to cross the coast, and that's where I want to be. The interesting thing about Haiyan was that it had a very strong steering pattern, and it moved really fast in basically a straight line, so it was fairly easy to figure out, okay, it looks like Tacloban's going to be ground zero or very close. So that's where I decided to set up for this, and it was a recipe for disaster.
Many, if not most of these residents, live in simple structures.
I'm okay.
I'm okay.
Hurricane Haiyan was not only headed straight for the islands, it was headed straight for the residents, who had nowhere safe to go.
In many cases, a lot of shelters and evacuations were not prepared far enough in advance for the residents. A lot of the residents could not leave their islands. There's no general way to protect residents on an island. The furthest that they can go is just slightly inland and still be in the storm surge direction.
So the typhoon was approaching, and I started to hear howling going through the building as the wind started to pick up, and that was the first sign that it was coming.
Okay, guys, I think the storm's gonna hit any minute.
It was like windy and rainy, and it started to get worse. And then it was just before 7 a.m. that the inner core of the typhoon arrived. It was this wall of wind and rain. That was the eye wall, the inner core of the typhoon moving in. And it just swept into the city, and all of a sudden the winds went just nuclear. You could hardly see like a block away. The wind was just roaring. Debris flying around, the whole building started shaking, windows started to smash, doors blew off. It was hitting. I tried to get a couple of shots from the rooftop, but I realized that that wasn't safe. And I realized, all right, I need to go downstairs. So I went down to the second or third floor. And even that wasn't safe because the wind was just, we were in this tight urban area, and so the wind wasn't blowing in a straight line. It was ricocheting off the building, so debris was just blowing in every direction. And it was like being inside a tornado, basically. Flying debris is lethal. If something hits you, it's over. So in this area of the Philippines, you've got a lot of tin roofs on buildings, and those things just rip off, and tin is very lightweight, and it's also lethal. And so stuff like that was just blowing around in every direction, just scattering like confetti. After a while, it started to clear a little bit. It was still blowing like crazy, but not as much, but it was just enough so you could see the street below. And what we realized is the street was no longer visible, it was water. The city was flooding. And that's when I realized the storm surge was coming into the city. The ocean was invading the city. So when a hurricane comes ashore, the wind actually pushes the ocean water up onto the land. That's called storm surge, and it's very dangerous because it floods places where people live. And it just overflowed into the city. And when it overflowed, it happened very fast. So fast that people couldn't get out of the way. The street had become a river, and it was coming up, and it was coming up fast. I noticed this building across the street, just a one-story building. A door opened, and people came out, some adults and some kids, and the water was really high. They were struggling across the street to get to our building because it was bigger and safer. And I was watching them, and I just started to feel like, oh my God, they're not gonna make it. That was the point I realized I needed to stop just sort of observing this and documenting it, and I needed to help because people were gonna die.
November 8th, 2013. Hurricane chaser Josh Morgaman is in Tacloban City, the Philippines. Hurricane Haiyan is ravaging the island. Even worse, the storm surge has caused water levels to rise, putting local unprepared residents at risk.
So our hotel was like a bunker. It was this sturdy concrete building on probably the highest part of the city. The hotel had become basically a refuge in the storm. So I ran downstairs, and it was mayhem on the first floor. The water was coming up.
Oh my God, this hotel.
People were panicking. And by the time the people on the first floor realized what was happening, they could no longer open the doors to their rooms. So they were stuck in these rooms with the water rising. These had become death traps, and they were smashing the windows, and they were screaming for help. I just felt like, oh my God, I'm gonna just watch people just die right in front of me. And I realized like, I had to just jump in and try to help.
Maybe here.
So a couple other guys and I, what we did is we just jumped in that water, and we went up to each window, and we were pulling people out of the windows, the elderly, children, the disabled, whoever, and putting them on mattresses and then floating them to the main staircase to then get them up to the second floor. And one by one, we just went back and forth to just basically drag people out of those windows. And it just became this mad rush to get everyone up the stairs into the second floor. It was already, the water was like coming up, you know, it was like you're just wading through it.
Watch your step here.
And, you know, I felt like so protective, you know, just bring her up those stairs, you know, and we got the whole family upstairs one at a time. And then it was time to look for others because there were people trapped everywhere. It was total panic at that point, just people shouting and crying for help. And, you know, it's just a blur in my head. I only remember, it's like kind of trying to remember a dream, like I only remember little pieces. I feel like my entire memory of it now is just what was captured on video because, I don't know, I was in some kind of, I was almost like in a mental fog. I felt like I was just like a machine, you know, just trying to like get people to safety. It was this mad rush to just get everyone up to the second floor. You know, some of them, you know, we pulled out of the windows and ferried on the mattresses. I remember carrying a little girl up the stairs. I remember me and another guy carrying an old man in a wheelchair up. I mean, it was just like whatever we had to do. It was just one at a time, just getting everyone up to that second floor.
Good.
Haiyan was an incredibly powerful typhoon, but it was quite small and it moved really fast. And what was interesting was, as soon as we got everyone up the stairs, the water started to pull away, the storm was passing.
Typhoon Haiyan was a learning experience indeed, both for residents, visitors, and the government in general. So this, a lot of people were caught off guard. The government did not know how to explain carefully to the residents how dangerous this situation was going to be. This is not the first nor the last super typhoon to hit the region. But at the moment, the government can look into building better structures, concrete or brick structures instead of wood or straw along the coastal regions, because these do not withstand the winds of a super typhoon of upwards of 250 kilometers per hour.
Thousands of people died in Super Typhoon Haiyan, and most of them were from the storm surge, that rise of the ocean onto the land. The tragic thing about that was that it didn't need to happen. If people understood beforehand what was coming and that storm surge was gonna happen, they would have gotten to higher ground. I'd never witnessed destruction or human misery on that level. It was just beyond anything I'd ever seen, and it was almost like as a defense mechanism, my emotions just shut down. I just stayed really kind of cold and like focused, like, okay, how do I survive? How do I get home? And once I got home and I kind of had the luxury to have emotions, I just like broke down, you know, just the misery that I witnessed and what I was seeing on the news even, just like, I was just like weeping, seeing it all. It stayed with me a long time. I didn't want to chase again for a while. And after all my years of chasing, that was the weather event that changed my life.
Lake Erie is the world's 12th largest lake. But when storms hit, the lake is notorious for behaving more like an ocean, with waves reaching 25 feet and wind gusts over 50 miles per hour.
Many people underestimate the power of the lake during extreme weather. They underestimate the strength of the winds, the risk of lightning, and the size of the waves. In the summer, or winter for that matter, the temperature of the air over the Great Lakes is going to be different from the temperature over the adjacent land. And so when the winds come down, it picks up that moisture and it cools and the water condenses and causes rainfall. They, on average, have 250 lightning flashes a year and 33 thunderstorms every year.
Andy Buss is a professional bass fisherman who's been fishing competitively for 18 years. No rookie to the weather, Andy has faced wind, rain, and thunderstorms while fishing over the Great Lakes.
I've been a competitive angler for about 18 years now, and for the last 4 years I've been blessed to compete professionally. I don't believe there's any weather that's too bad to go fishing in. On the lake, you have a pretty distinct advantage when you're reading the weather. You can see it hundreds of miles in advance before it gets to you. And I've always felt that someone who gets stuck in a storm, they made a bad decision. I spent 120, 150 days a year on the water. I've been in all sorts of weather conditions. I'm not an amateur. I'm not a novice when it comes to reading weather, but that all changed on September 19th, 2015. My boat's sinking. We're gonna die.
September 19th, 2015, Lake Erie, situated between the U.S. and Canada. Andy and his partner head off into Lake Erie in preparation for an upcoming tournament. There was nothing unusual about this day. It was going to be just another day of fishing on the lake.
So my buddy and I were preparing for the Bassmaster Open on Lake Erie, which took off out of Sandusky, Ohio. We headed north and we drove into Canadian waters, 22 miles roughly to get where we were heading. And while we were traveling, we were driving through 2.5, 3-foot waves. So we were driving roughly 30 miles per hour, 35 miles per hour. It was an overcast day. There was a slight breeze out of the west, and those waves, they didn't really slow me down. They were not concerning. I've been in 3-foot waves more times than I could count, and they were actually coming in the perfect direction. We were fishing maybe 3/4 of a mile on the east side of the island, and it was very calm. After about 2 hours of fishing, we looked off into the west, and I could see a rain cloud approaching, but it was just a rain cloud. It was still the morning. We knew stronger winds were forecasted later in the afternoon, but this was roughly 11 o'clock in the morning. I did not view this cloud coming as a threat. I thought we'd get rained on. That was it. It's not intimidating. There's not any lightning whatsoever. There's no thunder off in the distance. It's just gray. It looks like it's overcast. So we proceeded, and we did not have any reservations. I was not scared or worried. In my mind, that storm is not posing any kind of threat. And that rain cloud came on top of us. I mean, it was instantaneous. Boom. That wind just hit us so hard. It was like a fan turned on, but so tremendously powerful, it nearly knocked us out of the boat. It was that hard. It was so sudden, without any warning, and with it was torrential rain. And that rain was just coming at us horizontally. It was coming so hard, that wind was so strong, it was coming horizontally at us.
There was an extreme storm cell that moved across the lake. And when you have these storm cells, there is wind and changes in air pressure. That wind and air pressure interacts with the surface of the lake and causes ripples. And those ripples then propagate and become very, very large waves. And in fact, in some cases, you can actually cause mini tsunamis that sweep from one end to the other end of Lake Erie. And this actually happens 5 or 6 times a year.
In fact, due to the combination of gale force winds, large waves, and strong currents, there are close to 2,000 shipwrecks.
What's happening is that change in pressure pushes the water. You can imagine water sloshing back and forth in a bathtub. And so at one end, the water goes up, and the water is sort of pulled away, and then swishes back the other end. And so this is very hazardous. It can cause, capsizes boats. It causes what we call rip tides, which are, as that wave comes in, it then turns around and goes backwards. So it will pull people a kilometer out to sea or out to the lake.
An oncoming extreme storm was not a cause of concern for this experienced fisherman.
I'd been in some nasty things before, survived, came out okay, never had a problem. And it's a storm. And in my experience with storms, they never last forever. They never last all day, very rarely. They're typically an hour. And this storm, I had a hard time believing was First off, I had a hard time believing it was a storm. In my mind, I saw it coming. This looked like rain. I probably should have been nervous and scared immediately, but I wasn't. I had a hard time comprehending what was actually happening. It took 10 to 12 minutes to fully comprehend what was going on. I'm a real competitive guy. This tournament, $50,000 plus for first place. And I am a real competitive guy. I am committed to winning. I'm committed to figuring things out. And I pride myself in being tough and overcoming. So when that rainstorm came on us and it was hit with such force, it was kind of a mentality of, hey, let's do it. Let's have some fun. Let's dance with Mother Nature and Lake Erie here.
However, this particular dance with Mother Nature was about to take a major dip.
Those winds had to be 50 miles per hour plus. My partner and I are not saying anything to each other, and we couldn't hear each other even if we wanted to communicate. It was so loud because, first off, the wind, but then the rain, and these waves are building momentum, and they're building momentum so fast and so suddenly. Literally in 10 minutes, I went from thinking I'm okay, there's no threat, and 10 minutes later, it's time to get out of Dodge because this is becoming hostile. It's becoming dangerous.
A sudden and severe wind and rainstorm is ripping across Lake Erie. Pro bass fisherman Andy Buss and his partner are in the middle of the lake in preparation for an upcoming fishing competition. But they are not prepared for what is to come.
I mean, it hammered us. I mean, it was instantaneous. Boom.
Because Andy has fished in all types of weather, at first, he was not concerned.
The waves, when we arrived, were 3 foot, and in 10 minutes, they're 7 to 8 feet in height. When I'm looking at waves that are at least 2 feet taller than me, we've got a pretty good idea how tall those things are. But I have been in 8-foot waves before. Never got nervous, never got scared. But these were different.
Lake Erie is unique because of its geographical location, because of its shape, the shallowness, and it is known for having the capacity to have very high waves, waves that are meters tall.
I was experiencing something I'd only heard about before. What I found myself in was this dishwasher effect that I've only heard of before. I've never seen it. I've only heard about it. What that is I'm on a shoal, and that shoal is surrounded by 30 feet, and what a lot of mariners don't understand is that when a wave comes across the lake, it may be coming across that lake for miles and miles, and that the force of that wave is actually many feet deep. And when it hits an obstruction, like a shoal that suddenly comes up to 7 feet deep or 7 to 8 feet from the surface, it hits it, and it causes that wave, instead of to roll like this, which is much, much easier to navigate through, it hits and it forces some, what I'll call crest. And so out in the middle of the lake, you have these 8-foot waves, 7-foot waves actually white capping. They're breaking over the surface. And when you turn your boat into that, what happens is that wave literally rolls on top of your boat. And it happens so fast. And at that point in time, we realized it's time to get out of here.
As the shallowest Great Lake, Erie's waves tend to spring up in a matter of minutes. These 10 to 25-foot waves are violent and unpredictable in nature, creating a huge risk of drowning. Swimming is not an option. With the 2,000 shipwrecks already at the bottom of Lake Erie, Andy knows there's a chance this lake can swallow his boat just like an ocean.
Hundreds of people have died in Lake Erie during storms, drowning, boat capsizing, and then also lightning strikes are all really dangerous risks that are present during extreme weather on the lake.
I'm 28 miles from home. I'm 5 miles east to the protected side of an island. And I had these 8-foot waves pouring on top of us. I have to turn my boat into those waves and go those 5 miles to safety because there is no way I'm going to be able to navigate back to home. As I turn the boat into the waves, As soon as I come over that wave, you understand, I go 8 feet up, my boat comes over, it now free falls 8 feet essentially into the trough between the next wave. But it's the dishwasher effect, which means the very next wave is coming at a 60-degree angle from my left. So I've got to very quickly navigate to the next wave. The next wave after that, I go over that wave. Next wave after that might be coming straight on, or it might be coming from the left again, or from the right. So there is absolutely no pattern to navigate through. When it's so unpredictable, it's extremely challenging. And in a bass boat, where that water is made to flush down into the console area, and it would literally flood up to my ankles or even higher after almost every single wave. And mind you, I'm hitting a wave like this every 15 to 20 seconds. I've got 2 bilge pumps that'll pump out hundreds of gallons of water. What I didn't know is my automatic bilge pump, which I thought was running the entire time, is broke. And at that point in time is when I realized we're in some stuff now. The very back of my boat, it's underwater. Half of my outboard motor, my 250 horsepower motor is gonna save my life, is underwater. That tells me that everything in my boat behind me is completely full of water. We're talking hundreds of gallons of water in my boat. And I look at my partner and say, all right, you can probably start bailing some water. So he grabs that and he starts bailing. And you talk about a perfect progression of things that just go from bad to worse. And my outboard motor sputters and dies on me.
With water flooding the boat and his main engine not working, Andy now resorts to an electric trolling motor. The future looks bleak for Andy. A flooded boat, 8-foot waves, and having to use an electric motor.
My batteries that are controlling my trolling motor and everything else on that boat are completely submerged in water. Only a matter of time before those short out. It's at this time where I realize we need help. I'll try 911. I tell them who I am, where I am approximately, and I'm gonna die. If you don't come here to help me, please come help me. And they say the magical words of, we're sending somebody for you. I'm like, well, thank God.
Andy decides it's time to call his wife.
I decided as a husband that she deserved to hear my voice one last time. And that's when I broke it down to her. I said, babe, I'm in a real situation here. My boat's sinking. I'm over 4 miles away from anything safe. The Coast Guard has been dispatched to come get us. We're gonna die. It was a conversation with a lady who is real special. We ended by telling each other that we love each other. And, you know, I'm crying, basically. I am crying. In that conversation, I'm telling her that I love her and to tell my daughter how much Daddy loves her. And how much I love my boys.
"90 minutes after contacting the Coast Guard, they are rescued and towed to shore. Miraculously, Andy and his partner survived the perils of the storm.
I mean, the Great Lakes have outstanding fishing, but the storms are legendary. And the legendary part of the storms is that they do come without warning. Horrible weather doesn't just happen in the ocean. It happens on the Great Lakes. Now I am much more cautious when I get on the water, especially big water. Nasty things can happen on lakes just as much as they can on oceans. And my preparation My knowledge that I had before I get on the water, knowing the weather and the possibility, alters my plans accordingly to maximize safety. I always respected nature beforehand, but I think maybe I confuse that respect with love too. I love it. Now my respect for Mother Nature is to also acknowledge how vicious and brutal it is.